I wish to propose that it is this juxtaposition that has shaped the myth of the British landscape, where landscape is conceived as a tableau, pageant, passive, consumed nostalgia, or as a participatory, active event. In physically providing the mise en scène, the landscape of England is both the backdrop for conceptualized imagination and a place in which the rituals of collective existence are acted out and reinforced at the level of the spectacular and complex imaginaries. As Jacqueline Rose in States of Fantasy observed, there is no way of understanding political identities and destinies without letting fantasies into the frame. Fantasy and history came together in the design landscape at Elvenham in Hampshire, which was the stage for the Earl of Hertford's entertainment for Queen Elizabeth I on her visit to his estate in 1591. The use of hydraulic automata contributed to the artifice and illusion of this symbolic and emblematic landscape that was devised to tell a story about an exemplary kingdom that was poised between fantasy and political reality. The blending of scenography with architecture and engineering created the equivalent of today's multimedia spectacles. In the staging of the landscape of masques and festivals, the landscape itself became performative. The spectator was caught up in the enchantment and became a participant in the stage vision. In William Kent's early 18th century garden drawings, we see the beginnings of a new concern with human presence and action in relation to the scenery. Kent worked in theater as well as landscape design, and he required that garden visitors become actors as well as spectators, participants in the meaning of the scene. And actually, one of his drawings specifies the action to be taken by the visitors. The fluid geography of the 18th century English picturesque produced pleasure gardens, such as London's Vauxhall, as sites of public spectacle and social transformation that paralleled the spatial transformation in the landscape. The social classes and sexes mixed in what Giuliana Bruno describes as a composite moving space of promenade and flirtation. The pleasure gardens included a number of mechanized scenes, which foregrounded the fabrication of a simulated reality. These landscapes became encoded with meanings in an inverted tradition. What we're invited to see is a representation of Englishness. In the 18th century, landscape formed the backdrop to both fantasies of a lost Arcadia and a longing for a more recently absented rural existence. At Stour Head near Salisbury in Wiltshire, described by Charles Moore as an 18th century theme park, the elements and their allusions were woven into a complex narrative. Overlaid on a sequence of classical scenes are medieval references to England's past, most notably to the legend of King Arthur. In a self-confident, expansionist 18th century Britain, association was made between the Roman and British empires. In this image, the painting by Turner, we see the Bristol High Cross of 1373, which Henry Hoare re-erected at Stour Head in 1765. Behind the image of the Gothic cross, we can see the Pantheon, a classical building. So we have this juxtaposition of the Gothic with the classical. Hoare, who was from the Hoare banking family, also decided to build a tower dedicated to Alfred the Great after reading Voltaire's Histoire Générale. It was said to mark the location where Alfred erected his standard against Danish invaders in 870 AD. For those living in the 18th century, the English landscape was an imaginary realm of myth, magic, history, and legend, made more mystical through the presence of Stone and Bronze Age formations, the stone circles, the chalk figures, the tumuli, and the hill fortresses, the sacred places of ancient battles and kings. This mystical landscape was soon, however, under threat from new methods of cultivation and a new political structure, that of enclosure. Anne Birmingham has argued that the cult of the picturesque arose just when enclosure of the countryside was accelerating. The enclosure acts of the late 1760s coincided with the development of the theories of the picturesque, which shaped our present myth of the British landscape in the 20th century. Stephen Daniels, in the political iconography of woodland in late Georgian England, points out that throughout the 20th century, the picturesque has been mobilized to articulate English society, and often again with a sense of its duplicity as both the true England and a world of make-believe. This duplicity is addressed by Virginia Woolf in her novel Between the Acts. It's a story of a single day in June 1939 when a pageant about the history of England is being played upon the lawns of a country house by the local villagers. The war is imminent. The staging combines picturesque artifice and reality. Woolf's pageant is a version of the modern pageant play, a genre which includes T.S. Eliot's The Rock, 1934, and E.M. Forster's England's Pleasant Land, 1938. Woolf stresses the idea of community, the shared experience, and the existence of an essential England that might survive internal dividedness and international confrontation. Alex Swerdling in Virginia Woolf in The Real World says, "Her deep feeling is very different from mindless patriotism, a different kind of feeling for one's country, a love for its idiosyncratic culture and traditions, and a passionate attachment to the land." When the war broke out, just soon after Woolf had finished writing Between the Wars, the picturesque landscape continued to be drawn upon to evoke England and Englishness. Powell and Pressburger's film, A Canterbury Tales, made in 1944, is representative of the contemporary vision of England. In the film, the English landscape has a central role. It's the subject of Thomas Culpeper's lectures to the local servicemen on the English landscape, the picturesque, and its cultural significance. Paul Quinn, in his text, Britain Projected, writing of the Powell and Pressburger's Canterbury Tales, said, "That bend on the Pilgrim's Road is as good a route as any through British cinema. Everywhere you turn are rose-tinted visions of hedgerows and hills. The army vehicles that tear up the terrain bring home how precarious is this countryside, so that the film itself becomes a vehicle for conservation." While this picturesque view celebrated the rhythms of farming life, the beauty of the landscape, markets and festivals, and community life, a new wartime picturesque was being constructed from tarpaulins, wood, and paint. J.B. Jackson, when describing the military landscape he experienced as a serving officer in World War II, said, "Pageantry comes to mind when I recall the display of signs and notices that covered almost every lamppost and tree in the military landscape. The signs were often large and striking, composed of symbols and acronyms and colors, which had to be deciphered before they could be understood. Code names for units drawn from mythology or comic strip characters were inscribed on directional arrows. Bedraggled flags and pennants, lengths of colored wire and tape festooned the fences and the walls of the houses, like remnants of a bygone carnival, a medieval holiday, perhaps where everyone appeared in the costume of his trade or craft. It was also during the war when the architectural press began publishing articles in the Architectural Review promoting the principles of the 18th century picturesque: variety, curiosity, intricacy, costume, and balance. They set out to show how picturesque theories could co-create visually dynamic and exciting places, examples that would prove inspiration for a new generation of architects and designers in the 1960s. One of those was Archaeogram, who enlivened the post-war landscape with their scenographic projects for the new forms of transitory space and pleasure. They recognized that event space is based on a desire for belonging to a community, a desire pursued through playfulness and participation in festivals and celebration. The landscapes they created were like those of their predecessors, magical, idiosyncratic, and reflective of changing social values. Welfare State were a collective of radical artists and thinkers who were also exploring ideas of celebration and spectacle between 1968 and 2006. Welfare State was known for puppetry, song, myth, fire, drama, acrobatics, and fantastical engineering. Working out of doors shaped their aesthetic. Their 1969 manifesto sought an alternative, an entertainment, and a way of life. Engineers of the Imagination, the Welfare State's Handbook, was published in 1983, included instructions on how to make lanterns, puppets, and fire sculptures, and is still a great reference for festival makers today. Like Welfare State International in Cumbria, Frithgoff in Wales, Knee-High and Wildworks in Cornwall, have all created work inspired by and embedded within the landscape. They all ask questions about the relationship between landscape, experience, and identity, and explore the multiplicity of meanings that resonate in the landscape. Following on from their critically acclaimed 100 The Day Our World Changed, which was performed at the Gardens of Helligan in 2014 to mark the centenary of the start of World War I, Wildworks have since created 100 Unearthed, which explores the devastating aftermath of war. In 2001, Michael Shanks and Pearson published Theater Archaeology, in which they describe the concept of the deep map, saying how following 18th century antiquarian approaches to place, which included history, folklore, natural history, and hearsay, the deep map attempts to record and represent the grain and patina of place through juxtapositions and interpenetrations of the historical and the contemporary, the political and the poetic, the discursive and the sensual, the conflation of oral testimony, anthology, memoir, biography, natural history, and everything you might ever want to say about a place. They show us that everything, including movement, sound, and design concepts, follow from the site's dynamics, its essence, its ambience, and the memories. The spatial character of the site, its shape, proportion, the location of the foci, the long view and the close-up, both intimate and epic, the slope of the ground, the direction of the wind, the changing light, and the vagaries of the weather are central to the event. Audience seem to have a huge resilience to inclement conditions. It seems it binds them somehow. Their senses are heightened. They become more aware of each other and become a temporary community experiencing something new together. Pilgrimage is crucial. You need to make your way, often at some effort, to a special place in order to have the experience. Through the medium of the sight, the being here-ness, the spectator's self-awareness is raised. Going back to J.B. Jackson, he tells us, this is how we should think of landscapes, not merely how they look, how they conform to an aesthetic ideal, but how they satisfy elementary needs, the needs for sharing some of those sensory experiences in a familiar place. Popular songs, popular dishes, a special kind of weather supposedly found nowhere else, a special kind of sport or game played only here in this spot. A landscape should establish bonds between people, and above all, a landscape should contain the kind of spatial organization which fosters such experience and relationships. Spaces for coming together, to celebrate, spaces for solitudes, spaces that never change and are always as memory depicted them. These are some of the characteristics that give a landscape its uniqueness. These are what make us recall it with emotion. He goes on, for the military landscape revealed two aspects of humanity. It was not only a throwback to the brutality and primitiveness of the Dark Ages, it was also a glimpse of the future, those urgent, unremitting efforts to establish communications. The trailing wires and signs and symbols and colored lights foreshadowed our present groping for new kinds of community. That overreaching lust for power and mobility and final solutions is still transforming and mutilating the environment. The search for sensory experiences of the world as the most reliable source of self-knowledge is more insistent than ever.